The night was bitterly cold, and snow fell thick across the plains when a young farm boy named Thomas heard a faint knock on his barn door. He hesitated at first, thinking it was the wind. But then came another weak tap, followed by a soft cry. Lantern in hand, he pushed open the door and froze. A young Native American girl lay half buried in snow, trembling, her lips blue and her breath shallow. She couldn't have been older than 16. Her clothes were torn, and her eyes were filled with fear and pain. Thomas quickly rushed to her side. Without thinking twice, he carried her inside the barn and laid her gently on a pile of hay. He wrapped his only blanket around her, the one his late mother had made. He tried to offer her some milk and bread, but she was too weak to eat. As she whispered something in her native tongue, a tear slipped down her cheek. Thomas couldn't understand her words, but he could feel the desperation in her trembling voice. The night grew darker, and the wind howled outside. Thomas stayed beside her, feeding the horses quietly, glancing over every few minutes to make sure she was still breathing. But before dawn broke, her breathing stopped. The barn fell silent. Thomas knelt beside her lifeless body, holding her cold hand, whispering a small prayer. She had died in peace, wrapped in the warmth of his blanket, the only kindness she had known in her final hours. Thomas didn't know what to do. He decided to bury her on the hill behind the barn, where wildflowers would bloom in spring. He dug the frozen ground with trembling hands and placed her body gently in the earth, covering her with his blanket as her final resting shroud. He bowed his head in silence, feeling a deep ache in his chest. He didn't know her name, but he knew she deserved respect and dignity. By noon, the sun had melted some of the snow, and Thomas went about his chores. But as dusk fell, a low rumble echoed across the plains. He looked up and saw dust rising from the horizon, then figures on horseback, hundreds of them. His heart pounded. Within minutes, the valley filled with warriors, their faces painted, their spears gleaming. Nearly 700 Native American warriors formed a line outside his barn. Thomas stood frozen, fear gripping him. The oldest among them, a tall chief draped in buffalo fur, dismounted and walked slowly toward him. His gaze was sharp but calm. He spoke a few words in English, his voice deep and steady. "The girl you buried, she was my daughter." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The chief stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Then, to Thomas's surprise, he placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head. One by one, the warriors lowered their weapons and bowed too, not in anger, but in honor. The chief looked at the small grave on the hill and said softly, "You gave her peace. You have our respect forever." Then they mounted their horses and rode away silently into the setting sun, leaving Thomas standing by the barn, tears in his eyes, realizing that a simple act of compassion had bridged two worlds that had long stood apart.